Welcome to Radio Tipping Point. Our show today is titled The Steady State. And, of course, the state that we find ourselves to be in is anything but steady. But I'm hoping at the end of this 57-minute journey that together we will have a better idea of what that state should actually look like. And of course, the events of the last week or two have compelled me to take this conversation in a particular direction. And the first stop I would like to make would be tied to the events that took place in November of 2020, when we had the terrorist attack here in Vienna. There was a report at that time of two heroes who showed incredible courage, saving victims from their death, primarily policemen. And I thought it was quite cute, a report that I found in the newspaper from back then, translation from German. Even Interior Minister Karl Nehammer praised the selfless commitment of the men in a press conference. The two MMA martial artists of Turkish origin wanted to have a good time that evening before all pubs and restaurants in Austria were closed again for a second lockdown the next day. We wanted to go out again, have one last coffee before that lockdown, stated one of the heroes. And of course, as is often the case, although we continuously deny that situation that we as human beings are all confronted with, well, the story of the two heroes turned out a little bit different. Yes, they were invited to City Hall to be congratulated by the mayor, and shortly thereafter, it was revealed that our two heroes were actually members of the Turkish ultra-rightist Grey Wolf movement. So we were struck again with cognitive dissonance. How can our heroes do something like that? And we have our old friend René Descartes to thank for this type of attitude. Of course, maybe that's not quite fair. Descartes doesn't have a chance to defend himself today. But with this concept of dualism, either right or wrong, black or white, good or bad, we have trained ourselves not to be able to think any other way. But of course, in reality, it's much different. Perhaps in a less dramatic way, I'd like to talk about a situation I described here on the show. when I talked about listening to Brené Brown and her concept of scarcity, and I mentioned that it was uncanny that she would be talking about a condition. She was referring to us as individuals, that we are never content with ourselves. And it's always a case of never enough. And the example that I gave, had to have been a couple weeks ago, I guess, that I got home and I had the feeling I didn't get anything done that day. And then I woke up the next day and I said, I didn't get enough sleep. And lo and behold, what did I listen to from Brené Brown? She talked precisely about the situation that I just described. So that means that it's always on a particular trajectory. Our desires, our expectations, not just of others, but those that we have of ourselves. Now, it might sound a bit funny describing these two situations, but interestingly enough, they do have something in common, and I will get to that commonality later on in the show. Within this concept of growth and the means by which we judge to what degree we are making progress, we are compelled to look at this view from a different perspective. And I would like to approach that in talking about what I call the steady state. Now, a steady state infers that things remain more or less constant. And here I would argue on a meta level, meaning that we are not, as individuals, constant. We have good days and we have bad days. But they end up evening themselves out in some fashion. Certainly looking at it not just from my perspective, but from yours and everybody that we know. And if we take the cumulative, that things are skewed in one certain direction, then we compensate it in some fashion. And with that, we achieve that steady state. And they might be tied to making some sort of adjustments to the input that we're providing. And we try to keep that scale even. There is a clear way that we judge this concept, the steady state, certainly from a political perspective, and it's all based upon the concept of checks and balances. And we have that within the government. It might not necessarily always appear that way, But there are certain roles that the various departments play. We have, of course, Parliament and the President, where we say that the President does not hold much power. But we've noticed, especially over the last 4 years, that the President plays a very important role, clearly in setting the tone. And we do have a Supreme Court. And in fact, the judicial arm has shown its might. And with that, in spite of everything that's going on around us, there are attempts to reach that steady state. Very often in companies, you will have two individuals who are in charge. This is, of course, for larger organizations. We will have two roles, one being the chairman of the board, and then the chief executive officer, or the CEO. And of course, from an individual level, we have the phrase, too much of a good thing. It's my opinion, one of the reasons why alcohol has been accepted in our society for such a long time in comparison to maybe drugs. Although the impetus, or the rationale better said, the rationale would be pretty much the same. But with alcohol, we have this mechanism that sets us back to the steady state, meaning that if you consume too much alcohol, you don't feel well. And that is considered to be the trigger of us being reminded that too much of a good thing is actually not very good. And let's be honest, we all have those vices, and especially for an obsessive person like myself. I know that if I just take one, that I will not be able to hold back from taking another. Probably the worst vice is chocolate. Although some would argue I probably have a number of them. And the fact is, once I start, I cannot stop. So it's best not to go down that road. Now, nature works the same way. Nature works in a steady state. That does not mean that everything in nature is continuously in that steady state, but tied to the circle of life, the remnants of those things that die are used as nutrients to assist nature in maintaining that steady state. We can actually refer to it as being a natural law, where when we have overcompensation that takes place to adjust some of the excesses to be found somewhere else. And the concept of sustainability, one of those words that you ask 10 people and you'll get 11 or 12 different definitions. I asked the question to one of my students last Friday. In the paper that she submitted, she talked about a sustainable product. So I asked the question, what is that? Because we could have different definitions, and in fact I would argue that we probably will. And she was not ready for that. And within her definition of sustainability, she used the word sustainable 4 times. As if all of this is self-evident. I would argue that sustainability is maintaining this steady state. So that if we have excesses on one side, that we are compelled to overcompensate on the other. And while I'm at it, let me give you some more definitions for good measure. What about the word resilience? I would argue that this word resilience is the ability to make some sort of adjustments to bring us back to the steady state. So it's the impetus that we have, maybe that overcompensation, so that we can get back to the balance. And then, of course, the system, by and large, would be regeneration, which is the way that the steady state remains constant. So basically what I was describing to you from an imbalance and how we get back to the balance that would be tied to resiliency, and the whole system would be based upon regeneration. Now, a question for you. Is that only to be found within nature? Within this personal journey that I have been taking, probably since I've been around, but more specifically over the last few years, when I found the time to reflect something that I believe was not always there, but I was very grateful to find it. I've thought a lot about all of these things. And of course, all of these impulses that we get constantly. And I have come to the conclusion that we are really good about talking about nature. And we're really good about talking about ecological components. It might not necessarily always be the known knowns, but it appears to me that we know what the answers are. We just need to do them. But where we truly struggle and where we have been going through what I consider to be an immense overcompensation over at least the last 40 years is when we start looking at the social. Because if you agree with me, even if you're just being kind, about my definitions of a steady state, then I raise the question, to what degree do we have that steady state within our society? Concentrating on those things that make us us, that being humanity. Oh yes, we are much more aware of some of those injustices that have been around for a very, very long time, and you've heard enough about all of those injustices, or a number of those injustices, on this show, certainly this year especially. And I'm not necessarily referring to the monetary aspect, although that one is quite apparent in the enormity of the wealth to be found within certain individuals. But let's be honest. Within our society, we have enough for everybody. That we choose not to necessarily distribute it in a fashion to make sure that it is equitable is another question. But one thing's for sure. We are very, very far from having a steady state within our society. Now, this is not something that has just appeared out of the blue, especially looking at our situation over the last couple of years. But I would argue that our current condition has made all of this very, very visible. And part of the problem is this obsession that we have with more. And partially what I mentioned earlier tied to scarcity. A scarcity that truly is not there. But we feel that more is the only metric that is worth measuring. And to a certain degree, to a large extent in fact, it's all tied to some sort of external motivators. Something that is being bestowed upon us, either through the attention economy and us fighting for the attention of others, and of course the effect that takes place when you do not get that attention and you have the feeling that it doesn't make any difference. But in so many other ways, and I think that without really planning it, that this conversation prior to Christmas couldn't be more succinct. Because we are at a time of the year where we believe that more is clearly better. And we go through this ritual, at least through lip service, every year. Once these holidays are over, the New Year's resolution is a way of trying to overcompensate for those excesses so that we can reach our steady state. That we struggle in reaching the steady state is another question. But I would argue that we're not just talking about external motivators here. That I would argue that internal motivators are equally an obsession. And I think to a certain degree that I'm not alone, although this is almost a confession, where those internal motivators, not too dissimilar, didn't get enough done today, could have done much better. On a certain level, it's healthy and necessary, but when this becomes an obsession, then one has to argue is it really tied to those things that we're working on? And the joy in completing such exercises? But when we cannot make a differentiation between the task, the satisfaction, and the striving for more, and throw in an obsessive beat, then that's a rather toxic cocktail, I would argue. I've come to the conclusion that drive, and I think what I just described, that drive has a very important part in that description. Our motivation to do things, our striving, is a bit of a two-edged sword. Because that drive can lead us to burnout. Can our internal condition be based on excesses? And to what degree do we allow ourselves the ability to reflect after our efforts? I think that we have this on an individual level, quite obviously. And I think with that, I'm holding up the mirror to myself and maybe to some of you, and that's good. But within this concept of a steady state, we are talking about the collective. We're talking about our society. We are talking about our collective state. Now, I don't need to tell you about everything that has been going on the street and beyond, especially over this last week, where we have received the call for the majority to speak. And it proves how ironic it is always, to the degree that history continues to repeat itself. I remember a time in the 60s, early 70s, where there were very strong divisions, not just in the United States, but here in Europe as well, some countries more than others. And the impetus was very similar, regardless of which side of the Atlantic you were looking at the situation. But the reaction that took place in the States, primarily, I would say starting with the Nixon administration, although these tendencies were to be found in certain pockets of society earlier than that. But Nixon talked about the silent majority. And Nixon was making the same argumentation that what I have heard here over the last couple weeks. That being that we keep hearing about the minority, but we should not forget that they are the minority. And we are the majority, and we have rights, and we should go out on the streets and make ourselves known. That was the idea. I might be wrong, but I tend to think the divisiveness that was to be found at that time possibly could have even been worse than today. But this is, of course, all relative, and in the grand scheme of things, a moot point. But what actually took place? You had construction workers beating up on hippies. That was the way it was pointed. Because the hippies were just causing trouble. Now, I don't want to make any predictions. And certainly on a particular level, you could even go ahead and say that we see a little bit of an inkling taking place. And certainly listening to conversations with individuals. some of these tendencies have become a little bit overt, I would argue. But I wonder, how does all this help us in getting back to the steady state? If we look at what's taking place, and there is no question we are talking about excesses, and I put no value judgment on that. But certainly it's tied to people feeling compelled and very possibly their reaction might be tied to a correction that they are trying to create in reaching their own steady state. In some fashion, and has very often nothing to do with what is being said or what is being done. That these are reactions that are based on something more deep-seated, I would argue. But within this concept of society where we are looking to achieve, at least attempting to achieve, this idea of the steady state, the question I would raise is, being cognitive human beings, are we not capable of reaching the steady state, is putting that as our objective? We have a lot of imbalance. We've had it for a while. And we give it lip service, and this is the time of the year where perhaps we give it a little bit more lip service, as if the other 360 days in the year, it doesn't make much of a difference. But this is a way for us to maybe alleviate some of our guilt, although it will be quickly forgotten once we enter the new year, because by and large such reflection is not in vogue. But could we make that perhaps a collective holiday wish from all of us, that we figure out ways to truly reach that steady state? listening to Radio Tipping Point. And I'm Mike Boyle, the great pontificator, today, talking about the steady state, what it is, how that applies to us as an individual, why it's important to look at this concept from the collective, and of course, I will not leave you empty-handed with a challenge without giving you some ideas, certainly from my perspective, as to how we can actually approach that. And we're freestyling here, folks, meaning that I will not argue that we need to follow a particular order. This is more of a laundry list. But step number one has to be is getting off this more is better bandwagon. Because if we can free ourselves individually, and it would be my hope that if each individual attempts in his or her own way to liberate oneself from the more is better gremlin, then perhaps we can reach herd immunity of the more virus. So that would be a huge step. But of course, if we were to collectively decide that more will not drive us, that will cause certain repercussions. And we've seen it over and over again every time we have been compelled to make a decision over the last few years, and I'm talking about the lockdowns. The sword of Damocles has always been the economy. Because our claim is the economy cannot handle another lockdown. So we have to be very cognizant that in that collective refusal, in striving for more, that we will get pushback. So how do we deal with the pushback? And here I come to point number 2, that perhaps might even be the one that we start beforehand, although I tend to think a lot of these ideas need to work in parallel. But if we were to make a firm commitment towards the steady state as being our ideal, and taking care of people, taking care of the planet, and returning the surplus. We have a new definition for this idea of growth. How about that? And of course, I'm not thinking anything up myself here. I'm just borrowing things that have been lying around for a long, long time. Because I would argue that this model that comes straight out of permaculture is one of the best examples I could think of in maintaining that steady state. But that would mean we would need to get a lot of people on board to create that herd immunity against the more virus. Which leads me to step number 3. And step number 3 for me would be finding a way, making it part of our routine to look at things from a different perspective, a perspective that would not be our own. Instead of pointing the finger at, and I'll give you the choice of which finger you're pointing, but pointing the finger at somebody else is an easy way to alleviate frustration. Again, I am a sinner as much as anybody else. So please don't look at this list as something that I'm giving to you because I'm that much better, because I'm not. Clearly not. But if we could all ask ourselves the question, about these individuals that we are not necessarily happy with, we are able to ask the question, what's their story? What's the one we don't know? Can we make some assumptions? Maybe we might be able to even drum up the courage to give them some airtime and ask and get past the emotions. Tied to these things that in my mind we're talking about symptoms. If we were able to start a dialogue with these individuals and find out what that story actually is. Because I've come to the conclusion, if we're able to eliminate the demonization and if we are able to conduct conversations with other human beings in that thing that we know the best, that's called the human voice, that basically it makes it very difficult for us to demonize these people. Doesn't mean we solve everything, but it's a damn good way to get us on the right road. And like I said, this is not in any particular order. I'm just freestyling here, folks. But that would be number 3. And number 4 would have to be ways that we ensure that each individual, each living thing in our society is considered to be valuable. It's looked upon as having a worth. And if we catch ourselves every time in our reaction, which is all normal, of maybe counting to 10 is probably one that I should do a little bit more. But if we were able to, before we do anything, build a mantra that we say to ourselves constantly. This person deserves respect. This person is valuable. This person is worthy. If we could do that, then what are the chances that we have of perhaps breaking down some of these barriers, eliminating some of these excesses? Performing, let's call it positive overcompensation. What do you think if we were able to take these 4 components and consider them to be an open source recipe that everybody can take? No charge. Free of charge. Special offer just for you. Not just today, every day. What do you think the chances are if we were to put this as our utmost priority in making it our collective goal, you and me and all of our friends, making it our goal to move that much closer in reaching the steady state for 2022. I don't know about you, but I think that might be one of the best Christmas presents I could ever think of, or whatever the holiday might be from your side. Okay, well, I think we're getting pretty much to the end here. I'd like to thank you for letting me indulge in some of these thoughts for today and, of course, throughout 21. And please feel free to reach out to me if you think any of these ideas are worth pursuing. Happy holidays.